"Don't touch that notebook, Mr. Carter. Your son is not presenting this project today." The words cut through the crowded school gymnasium before anyone could hear the quiet boy standing beside the science display. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of a school science fair morning, the shuffle of parents' shoes across polished floors, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the excited whispers of students hoping their ideas would finally be seen. But 12-year-old Ethan Miller stood frozen beside a small table pushed into the far corner, holding a worn blue notebook against his chest like it was the only thing in the room that still believed in him. Across the gym, parents gathered around the larger displays with bright posters, expensive materials, and carefully prepared presentations. Their children wore confident smiles. Their names were printed in bold letters. Ethan's project had been moved away from the center, almost hidden behind a row of folding chairs. And standing near him was Daniel Carter, a quiet single father wearing a school maintenance uniform, the same uniform people passed every day without noticing. He had spent years cleaning classrooms, fixing broken lights, and making sure other people's children had a safe place to learn. Most people knew him as the man with the mop and toolbox. Almost no one knew he had once been a mechanical engineer who designed systems for research companies before life forced him onto a different path. Daniel looked at Ethan, not with pity, but with respect. "What happened?" he asked softly. Ethan lowered his eyes. "They said my work looks copied." "Did anyone ask you to explain it?" Daniel asked. The boy stayed silent. That silence told him everything. A teacher named Mrs. Whitmore stood nearby, holding Ethan's project evaluation sheet. Her voice remained polite, almost kind, but her decision had already been made. "Daniel, we have standards. The science board cannot spend time on projects that appear questionable." She glanced toward the larger displays. "Some students have prepared more advanced work." Daniel looked around the room. He saw the difference between confidence and opportunity. Some students had parents who knew exactly what to say. Some had resources that made their projects shine before anyone even understood the idea behind them. But Ethan had only a notebook filled with handwritten pages, small sketches, and years of quiet effort. "Can I see the notebook?" Daniel asked. Ethan hesitated before handing it over. The cover was faded. The corners were bent. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. But when Daniel opened the first page, he stopped. There was no copied paragraph, no printed research paper, only a child's handwriting and a simple circular diagram drawn in pencil. Around the shape were notes, measurements, and tiny corrections written over months of testing. At the top of the page were 4 words. "Test number 47. Still works." Daniel slowly turned another page. Then another. The room around him seemed to fade. Ethan had not written down one idea. He had documented every mistake, every adjustment, every question. He had been learning through failure the way real discoveries were often made. A parent nearby noticed Daniel looking through the notebook and smiled. "Interesting, isn't it? Maybe he should have practiced a little more before entering." A few people laughed quietly. Daniel closed the notebook. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed the notebook back into Ethan's hands. "Tell me something," he said. "Why did you draw this circle?" Ethan looked surprised by the question. No one had asked about the circle. They had only asked where it came from. "Because every part affects the next part," Ethan whispered. "I thought if one small thing changes, the whole system changes." Daniel looked at the young boy standing in front of him and saw something others had missed. Not perfection, not a finished genius, just a child with an idea waiting for someone to listen. Behind them, the science board members prepared to move on to the next project. Mrs. Whitmore picked up Ethan's display card. "We need to keep the schedule moving." Daniel gently stepped beside Ethan. "Then give him 5 minutes." The teacher looked at him. 5 minutes for what? Daniel held the notebook in his hand and answered calmly, "For the chance to explain his own work." The gym grew quieter, because for the first time that morning, someone was not asking whether Ethan deserved to be there. Someone was asking whether anyone had truly taken the time to hear him. The question remained hanging in the air. 5 minutes. It sounded small, almost meaningless in a room where schedules, rankings, and expectations seemed more important than one quiet student's voice. But to Ethan Miller, those 5 minutes felt like the first real opportunity he had been given all morning. Daniel Carter stood beside him, not in front of him. He did not pick up the presentation board. He did not explain the science. He simply stood there as a reminder that Ethan did not have to disappear. "You really want to let him present?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, keeping her voice calm. "The judges have limited time." Daniel looked at Ethan before answering. "Then let him use the time he was already supposed to have." The words were simple, but they carried something the room had been missing: respect. Ethan slowly walked toward his display table and picked up the small model he had built from recycled materials. His hands were nervous. He looked at the faces around him and saw the same doubt he had seen all year. The students who spoke louder. The parents who arrived with expensive equipment. The teachers who already knew which names would be celebrated before the competition even started. Daniel noticed Ethan's hesitation. "Look at me," he said quietly. Ethan looked up. "Do not try to impress them. Just explain what you discovered." The boy took a breath. "I started with a question," Ethan said. His voice was soft, but the gym became quieter. What if a system could adjust itself by learning from small changes instead of staying the same? Some people looked interested. Others looked confused. Ethan opened his notebook and pointed to the first circular diagram. "I tested different patterns. Every time something failed, I wrote down why. The mistakes showed me what needed to change." One of the science board members, Dr. Harris, leaned forward slightly. He was known for being careful with every project he reviewed. He did not smile. He did not react. He simply watched. Daniel stayed near the back of the table, letting Ethan own the moment. But then a voice interrupted. "That idea already exists." It came from Mr. Lawson, the father of another student whose project stood in the center of the gym. He stepped forward with a confident expression. "Several concepts like this can be found online. It looks like a student recreated something without understanding it." The room shifted. Doubt returned quickly. Ethan lowered his notebook. Daniel saw the change in the boy's face. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter. The feeling of someone who had expected this all along. Daniel looked at Mr. Lawson and then at the judges. "Has anyone compared his actual notes?" he asked. Mrs. Whitmore answered, "The concern is similarity." "Similarity is not proof," Daniel replied. "A question can have more than one person searching for an answer." For a moment, nobody responded. Then Dr. Harris reached out his hand. "May I see the notebook?" Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. "Give it to him." The scientist opened the worn pages carefully. He turned through the early sketches, the crossed-out calculations, and the handwritten observations. The longer he looked, the quieter he became. "How long have you been working on this?" Dr. Harris asked. Ethan answered honestly. "Almost a year." "And who helped you?" Ethan glanced at Daniel. "Nobody with the science part. Mr. Carter just asked me questions." That answer surprised several people. Daniel did not take credit. He did not step forward. He let the truth belong to the person who created it. Dr. Harris turned another page and stopped. There was a small note written beside the circular diagram. A note that had been overlooked by everyone else. He read it twice. Then he looked toward the other judges. "Interesting." The word was quiet, but the room noticed. Because for the first time that day, someone with authority was not questioning whether Ethan belonged. They were wondering what else they had failed to see. The gymnasium had changed. Not completely, not yet, but enough for Daniel Carter to notice. The whispers that once carried judgment now carried curiosity. Parents who had looked away from Ethan Miller were now looking closer. The same notebook that had been ignored moments earlier was suddenly the center of attention. But Daniel knew better than anyone that attention was not the same as understanding. A person could be noticed and still not be heard. Ethan stood beside his project, waiting for the next question. He held the notebook with both hands, careful not to bend the pages that had recorded months of effort. Dr. Harris continued studying the notes, moving slowly from one page to another. "You documented every adjustment?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I thought if I only showed the final version, people would not understand why I made the changes." Dr. Harris looked up. "That is actually the part most people forget." The scientist pointed to several crossed-out sections. "The process tells the story." From across the room, Mr. Lawson watched closely. His expression remained polite, but his confidence had weakened. He stepped forward again. "That still does not prove the original idea came from him. It was a reasonable question. That was what made it powerful. No one could simply ignore it. A fair investigation required more than emotion. It required evidence." Daniel appreciated that. He did not want Ethan protected from questions. He wanted Ethan given the chance to answer them. "That is exactly why the notebook matters," Daniel said. "Because it shows the timeline." Mrs. Whitmore looked at him. "Timeline?" Daniel nodded toward the pages. "A copied idea usually starts with a finished answer. This starts with questions, mistakes, and revisions." He did not speak like someone trying to impress the room. He spoke like someone who understood the difference between appearance and truth. Dr. Harris returned to the first pages. His eyes followed the dates written beside each experiment. September, October, November. Small notes filled the margins. A different material tested. A different measurement recorded. A different result analyzed. The details were not dramatic. They were ordinary. And that was exactly why they mattered. "Ethan," Dr. Harris asked, "why did you keep all of this?" The boy looked down at the notebook. "Because I thought I might forget what I learned." The answer was so simple that the room became quiet again. Daniel watched Ethan carefully. For months, this boy had carried a notebook full of ideas, but nobody had asked him about the person behind them. They only asked whether he deserved the space he occupied. Near the judge's table, another science board member reached for the evaluation sheet. She compared the original score with the project notes. "Something does not match here," she said. Mrs. Whitmore turned. "What do you mean?" The judge pointed to the comments. "The report says the student could not explain the method, but the notebook shows detailed explanations on every page." The room became still. Daniel looked at Ethan. The boy looked just as surprised as everyone else. Someone had already decided what he was capable of before hearing him speak. That was the real problem. Mr. Lawson adjusted his position and offered another explanation. Maybe someone helped him write it. It was another possibility. Another question. But this time, Ethan answered before Daniel could. "Nobody wrote it for me." His voice was still quiet, but stronger than before. "I wrote everything because I wanted to understand it." The statement was not a performance. It was not rehearsed. It was simply the truth. Dr. Harris studied the boy for a moment. Then he looked back at Daniel. "You said you only asked him questions." Daniel nodded. "That is all." "Why?" the scientist asked. Daniel paused. He looked at the crowded gym, the polished displays, the names printed in large letters, and the one child whose work had almost been placed out of sight. "Because sometimes people do not need someone to give them the answer," Daniel said. "Sometimes they need someone to believe they are capable of finding it." Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. But before the moment could settle, Dr. Harris closed the notebook and noticed something unusual written on the inside cover. A name. Not Ethan's. Not Daniel's. A name that changed the direction of the entire investigation. The name written inside the notebook was not Ethan Miller. It was a name that made Dr. Harris stop and look twice. The handwriting was small, almost hidden beneath the edge of the cover. It was not a signature. It was a note of gratitude. "For Mr. Carter, who taught me that questions matter." The room did not know what to make of it. Daniel Carter looked at the notebook, then at Ethan. The boy lowered his eyes. "I was going to tell you," Ethan whispered. "I just did not know if it mattered." Daniel felt something heavier than surprise. He felt the weight of a child who had learned that good things could be ignored if the right people did not notice them. "Who is Mr. Carter?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. Ethan looked at Daniel. "Him." A quiet murmur moved through the gym. Some parents exchanged confused looks. The maintenance worker standing beside the science display suddenly became part of the story everyone thought they already understood. But Daniel shook his head gently. "I did not create this project," he said. "Ethan did." The answer was immediate. "No hesitación." No attempt to take credit. Dr. Harris studied Daniel for a moment, then returned his attention to the notebook. "You helped him?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "I helped him keep asking questions." It was a simple statement, but it revealed something important. Ethan had not needed someone to build his project for him. He had needed someone who did not laugh when his ideas were unusual. Someone who did not mistake quietness for weakness. Across the room, Mr. Lawson stepped forward again. His voice remained controlled. "That still does not explain the similarity between his project and existing research." This time, his concern sounded less like curiosity and more like a final attempt to keep doubt alive. Dr. Harris looked at him. "You are correct. Similarity should be examined." The judge-like calm in his voice returned. "But examination works both ways. We need to compare the public information with the development process." The science board members gathered closer. They asked Ethan questions about his method. At first, his answers were short. He looked toward Daniel several times, searching for reassurance. But Daniel never answered for him. He only nodded, reminding Ethan that the moment belonged to him. "Why did you change this part here?" one judge asked. Ethan looked at the page. "Because the first version worked in theory, but not in practice." "How did you know?" another judge asked. "Because I tested it 32 times. A few people looked surprised. 32. Dr. Harris repeated. Ethan nodded. The first 28 did not work. The room became quieter. The judges looked at each other. Failure was not something they expected from a child who had been accused of copying. They expected a shortcut. They found a process. Then Mrs. Whitmore picked up the original evaluation sheet again. Her eyes moved across the comments. "Wait!" Everyone looked at her. She turned the paper around. The concern was written before the final review. Dr. Harris frowned slightly. "Before the review?" She nodded. "The project was flagged yesterday." "By whom?" he asked. Silence followed. It was only a few seconds, but everyone felt it. A small pause. A missing answer. A crack in the story. Mr. Lawson looked away. Mrs. Whitmore adjusted the papers in her hand. There was a concern raised by a parent. Daniel noticed something important. The accusation had arrived before anyone had finished checking the evidence. The judgment came before the investigation. And now, the notebook sitting in the center of the table was quietly challenging everything people believed. Dr. Harris turned another page and found a section Ethan had marked with a circle. "What is this?" he asked. Ethan stepped closer. "That is the part nobody has tested yet." "Why not?" the judge asked. Ethan hesitated. "Because I was told the project was already decided." The words were soft, but they landed harder than any accusation could. Daniel looked around the gym, the expensive displays, the confident parents, the students who had been given every chance to succeed. Then he looked back at Ethan and the notebook that almost disappeared into a corner. Something had changed. The question was no longer whether Ethan copied someone else. The question was who had decided he was not worth listening to in the first place. And on the next page of the notebook, there was a test result that could reveal the answer. The page Ethan Miller had marked with a circle was not just another experiment. It was the missing piece of a story that nobody had bothered to read. Dr. Harris carefully placed the notebook on the table and looked at the young boy standing beside him. "Show us." Ethan hesitated. The attention felt unfamiliar. For months, he had worked quietly at home, testing ideas after school, writing notes under the soft light of a small desk lamp. He was comfortable with numbers, diagrams, and questions. He was not comfortable with a room full of people waiting for him to prove he belonged. Daniel noticed the hesitation. He stepped closer, but not too close. "You already know this," he said quietly. "You do not have to become someone else just because people are watching." Ethan took a breath and opened the notebook. "This part was my first design," he explained, pointing to the circular diagram. "I thought the system needed to move in a straight pattern. But after testing it, I noticed the results changed depending on how each part affected the others." One of the judges leaned forward. "So you changed the structure because the original design failed?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." "And you recorded every failure?" "Yes." The judge looked at the pages. "Why?" Ethan answered without thinking. "Because mistakes tell you what the system is trying to say." For a moment, nobody spoke. The sentence came from a 12-year-old boy, but it carried the patience of someone who had spent a long time learning. Daniel watched quietly. He knew this was not about making Ethan look brilliant. It was about letting the boy be honest. Across the table, Mr. Lawson folded his arms. "That sounds impressive, but children can memorize explanations. We still need independent verification." Dr. Harris nodded. "That is fair." Daniel respected the response. A real answer did not need protection from questions. It needed to survive them. The board members prepared a small evaluation test using the materials already displayed at Ethan's station. No expensive equipment. No special treatment. Just the same conditions expected from every student. Ethan adjusted the model carefully. His fingers moved. Slowly, following the instructions he had written himself. The room watched. Some expected confidence. Others expected the project to fall apart. Daniel noticed something else. Ethan was no longer looking at the floor. He was looking at his work. The first attempt produced an unexpected result. A few parents exchanged looks. Mr. Lawson immediately spoke. "There it is." But Dr. Harris raised his hand. "Wait." He looked at Ethan. "What happened?" Ethan looked at the result, then opened the notebook. "This happened before." He turned to a page near the middle. There was a note written beside a small drawing. "Adjustment needed when outside conditions change." Dr. Harris read the line carefully. "You predicted this?" Ethan nodded. "I did not know exactly when it would happen. I just knew the pattern." The judge looked impressed but remained careful. "Can you explain why?" Ethan walked through the steps. Slowly. Clearly. Not like someone repeating information. Like someone who understood it. The room grew quieter with every answer. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who had spent the morning defending the decision to remove his project, listened without interruption. Then Dr. Harris looked back at the notebook. "How many pages are there?" he asked. Ethan answered, 112. "And all of these are yours?" "Yes." "No one helped you write the explanations?" Ethan looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter helped me organize my questions. But the work is mine." Daniel lowered his eyes. That answer mattered more than any award. Because Ethan understood something important. Support was not the same as replacement. Guidance was not the same as ownership. Then one of the board members noticed a small detail in the testing notes. "Hold on." Everyone turned. She pointed to a date written near the bottom of the page. This experiment was completed before the online article everyone mentioned was published. The room shifted. A simple date. A small detail. But sometimes the smallest pieces of truth were the ones that changed everything. Mr. Lawson looked toward the notebook again. The accusation of copying was becoming harder to defend. But before anyone could speak, Dr. Harris turned. Another page and discovered a section Ethan had never shown anyone. A section labeled with 3 words, "The original idea." The page Ethan Miller had marked with a circle was not just another experiment. It was the missing piece of a story that nobody had bothered to read. Dr. Harris carefully placed the notebook on the table and looked at the young boy standing beside him. "Show us." Ethan hesitated. The attention felt unfamiliar. For months, he had worked quietly at home, testing ideas after school, writing notes under the soft light of a small desk lamp. He was comfortable with numbers, diagrams, and questions. He was not comfortable with a room full of people waiting for him to prove he belonged. Daniel noticed the hesitation. He stepped closer, but not too close. "You already know this," he said quietly. "You do not have to become someone else just because people are watching." Ethan took a breath and opened the notebook. "This part was my first design," he explained, pointing to the circular diagram. "I thought the system needed to move in a straight pattern. But after testing it, I noticed the results changed depending on how each part affected the others." One of the judges leaned forward. "So you changed the structure because the original design failed?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." "And you recorded every failure?" "Yes." The judge looked at the pages. "Why?" Ethan answered without thinking. "Because mistakes tell you what the system is trying to say." For a moment, nobody spoke. The sentence came from a 12-year-old boy, but it carried the patience of someone who had spent a long time learning. Daniel watched quietly. He knew this was not about making Ethan look brilliant. It was about letting the boy be honest. Across the table, Mr. Lawson folded his arms. "That sounds impressive, but children can memorize explanations. We still need independent verification." Dr. Harris nodded. "That is fair." Daniel respected the response. A real answer did not need protection from questions. It needed to survive them. The board members prepared a small evaluation test using the materials already displayed at Ethan's station. No expensive equipment. No special treatment. Just the same conditions expected from every student. Ethan adjusted the model carefully. His fingers moved slowly, following the instructions he had written himself. The room watched. Some expected confidence. Others expected the project to fall apart. Daniel noticed something else. Ethan was no longer looking at the floor. He was looking at his work. The first attempt produced an unexpected result. A few parents exchanged looks. Mr. Lawson immediately spoke. "There it is." But Dr. Harris raised his hand. "Wait." He looked at Ethan. "What happened?" Ethan looked at the result, then opened the notebook. "This happened before." He turned to a page near the middle. There was a note written beside a small drawing. "Adjustment needed when outside conditions change." Dr. Harris read the line carefully. "You predicted this?" Ethan nodded. "I did not know exactly when it would happen. I just knew the pattern." The judge looked impressed but remained careful. "Can you explain why?" Ethan walked through the steps. Slowly. Clearly. Not like someone repeating information. Like someone who understood it. The room grew quieter with every answer. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who had spent the morning defending the decision to remove his project, listened without interruption. Then Dr. Harris looked back at the notebook. "How many pages are there?" he asked. Ethan answered, 112. "And all of these are yours?" "Yes." "No one helped you write the explanations?" Ethan looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter helped me organize my questions. But the work is mine." Daniel lowered his eyes. That answer mattered more than any award. Because Ethan understood something important. Support was not the same as replacement. Guidance was not the same as ownership. Then one of the board members noticed a small detail in the testing notes. "Hold on." Everyone turned. She pointed to a date written near the bottom of the page. This experiment was completed before the online article everyone mentioned was published. The room shifted. A simple date. A small detail. But sometimes the smallest pieces of truth were the ones that changed everything. Mr. Lawson looked toward the notebook. Again, the accusation of copying was becoming harder to defend. But before anyone could speak, Dr. Harris turned another page and discovered a section Ethan had never shown anyone. A section labeled with 3 words, "The original idea." The words written at the top of the page changed the atmosphere inside the gymnasium. The original idea. It was not a claim of greatness. It was not a title meant to impress anyone. It was simply Ethan Miller trying to remember where his curiosity had begun. Dr. Harris looked at the page carefully. Beneath the heading were simple drawings, early questions, and small observations written in a child's handwriting. There were no complicated explanations. There was only a record of a young mind trying to understand something. Ethan, Dr. Harris asked, when did you create this first version? Ethan looked at the date. Last August. The judge glanced toward the other board members. The science fair had started with a simple concern about copying, but now the timeline was telling a different story. Daniel Carter remained silent beside the table. He knew this moment did not belong to him. His role was never to become the answer. His role was to make sure Ethan had the chance to find his own. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer, studying the notebook. You never showed this page during your original review. Ethan looked down. I tried. The teacher paused. What do you mean? Ethan gently touched the edge of the notebook. I brought my notes, but I was told the presentation needed to be shorter because the judges had already seen similar projects. The words were not angry. That was what made them difficult to ignore. Ethan was not accusing anyone. He was simply describing what happened. Dr. Harris turned toward the evaluation papers again. Who reviewed this project before today? Mrs. Whitmore answered carefully. I did the first review. And what criteria did you use? He asked. She explained the process. The judges listened. The questions were respectful, but they were becoming more specific. Not an attack, an examination. That difference mattered. Daniel watched the room change. Earlier, everyone had been asking whether Ethan was good enough. Now they were asking whether the process had been fair enough. A parent near the display tables whispered, so the problem was not the project. The problem was that nobody looked closely. Daniel heard the words but did not react. He had learned long ago that truth did not need someone to celebrate it immediately. It needed time to stand. Dr. Harris returned to Ethan. We need one more thing. Ethan looked nervous again. What? A live demonstration. The request was reasonable. Evidence needed to exist beyond paper. The notebook had explained the journey. Now the project had to prove itself. The board members prepared the materials. They did not give Ethan extra tools. They did not make the conditions easier. They simply allowed him to demonstrate the idea that had been questioned all morning. Daniel stepped back. Ethan noticed. Are you leaving? He asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. No. I am letting you do what you built. That sentence stayed with Ethan. He placed the notebook beside the project and began. The first step was careful. The second step was slower. Every movement followed the notes he had written months earlier. The room watched as the boy who had barely spoken all morning explained each choice with growing confidence. Then the system reached the point where the earlier test had failed. Everyone waited. Ethan looked at the model. He looked at his notes. Then he made one small adjustment. The result changed. Not dramatically, not like a movie moment, just enough to show that he understood. Dr. Harris leaned forward. Why did you change that part? Ethan answered, because the problem was not the design. It was the timing. The judge looked at the notebook. The explanation was there, written weeks before anyone questioned him. The evidence was building. But then Mr. Lawson noticed something on the table and spoke quickly. Wait, that adjustment was made after the first submission. Everyone turned. For the first time, his question sounded different. Not confident, not certain, just concerned. Dr. Harris looked at Ethan. Is that true? Ethan opened the notebook again and searched through the pages. Then he stopped. His expression changed, because the answer was there. But it was not where anyone expected it to be. The notebook was open on the table, and for a moment, nobody moved. Ethan Miller stared at the page as if he already knew what everyone else was about to discover. Dr. Harris looked down at the handwritten notes, waiting patiently. Ethan, what is it? He asked. The boy slowly pointed to a small line written near the bottom of the page. It was easy to miss, just a few words beside a date. First successful adjustment. The room became quiet. Ethan turned a few pages backward. I wrote this before the final version, he explained. I just did not know which parts would matter. Dr. Harris followed the timeline carefully. The first design, the early tests, the changes, the adjustments. Every step existed before the science fair presentation. The notebook was no longer just a collection of ideas. It was a record of growth. But one question remained. Mr. Lawson stepped closer. If the adjustment happened before the submission, then why was it not included in the original display? It was a fair question. Daniel noticed that. He did not want the truth to come from people ignoring difficult questions. He wanted it to survive them. Ethan looked toward the display board. Because I thought it was too complicated. Too complicated for who? Dr. Harris asked. Ethan paused. For everyone else. That answer stayed in the air. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was honest. Daniel looked at the young boy and understood something important. Ethan had not hidden the information because he was trying to deceive anyone. He had hidden it because he had already learned that being different sometimes made people stop listening. Mrs. Whitmore walked toward the table. Her expression had changed. She was no longer defending a decision. She was trying to understand it. Why did you not explain this during your review? She asked. Ethan answered quietly. I tried to explain the circle diagram, but I was told the judges needed something easier to understand. The teacher looked down. For the first time, the possibility appeared that the problem had never been the student's ability. It had been the way people chose to interpret him. Dr. Harris looked at the other judges. We need to verify the dates. The board members reviewed the notebook again. They compared the handwritten entries with the digital submission records. The room waited. Minutes passed slowly. The sounds of the science fair continued around them. Students presenting projects. Parents taking pictures. Teachers moving between tables. But at Ethan's station, everything felt still. Then one of the judges spoke. The dates match. Another judge checked the online information that had created the original concern. The similar research article was published 2 months after Ethan's first documented experiment. A quiet reaction moved through the crowd. Not a celebration. Not yet. Just the sound of people realizing they had been certain about something they had not fully examined. Mr. Lawson looked at the notebook again. His son stood nearby, watching the conversation unfold. The competition that was supposed to be about science had slowly become something else. A lesson about assumptions. Dr. Harris closed the notebook carefully. Ethan, there is something I want to understand. The boy looked up. Why did you continue working on this after the first attempts failed? Ethan looked at the pages filled with corrections and notes. Because I wanted to know why it failed. The scientist smiled slightly. That is usually where real discoveries begin. Daniel watched quietly from the side. He did not smile because he wanted recognition. He smiled because Ethan was finally experiencing something every child deserved. The feeling of being taken seriously. But just as the room began to accept the evidence, Dr. Harris noticed another detail in the submission records. The project file had been changed after Ethan turned it in. The description was different from the one in his notebook. Someone had rewritten the explanation before the judges saw it. The question was no longer only whether Ethan's work was real. Now they had to find out who changed his story before anyone had the chance to hear it. The science fair continued around them, but at Ethan Miller's table, time seemed to slow down. The discovery that the project description had been changed created a new question, one that was no longer about a student's ability. It was about the path between his original work and the version the judges received. Dr. Harris looked at the submission records again. Who entered the final description into the system? He asked. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward carefully. The teachers submit the information after reviewing each project. Who made the final edits? Dr. Harris asked. The teacher looked uncertain. That uncertainty was enough for everyone to notice. Daniel Carter stood quietly near Ethan. He did not want anyone blamed without proof. He had spent enough years around machines and systems to understand one thing. A problem was not solved by guessing where the damage began. It was solved by following the evidence. Can we see the original file? Daniel asked. A few people looked surprised that the maintenance worker had spoken again. But Dr. Harris nodded. That is exactly what we need. Mrs. Whitmore opened the school system on a nearby laptop. The screen showed the project submission history, the original upload, the review comments, the final version. The timeline appeared one piece at a time. Ethan watched silently. His own words were on the screen, but parts of them had been simplified. The section explaining his testing process had been shortened. The explanation of the circular diagram had been removed. The part about the 32 failed tests was gone. What remained was a short description that made the project look like a simple idea without a clear foundation. Dr. Harris looked at Ethan. "Did you approve this version?" Ethan shook his head.
No.
"Did you know it was changed?"
No.
Daniel looked at the screen. The missing information explained everything. Without the process, the project looked incomplete. Without the notes, the idea looked impossible. The truth had not disappeared. It had simply been hidden behind a different story. One of the judges examined the revision history. There was an edit made the night before the fair. The room became quiet. Who made the edit? Mrs. Whitmore looked at the account information. Her expression changed. "It was my account." Ethan looked down. For a moment, everyone waited for an explanation. Mrs. Whitmore took a breath. "I did review the project, but I did not intend to remove important information." Dr. Harris asked calmly, "Then why was it removed?" The teacher looked toward the larger displays across the gym. "Because we were told the final presentations needed to be simpler. The board wanted projects that could be understood quickly." Daniel listened carefully. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment, because sometimes unfairness did not come from someone trying to be cruel. Sometimes it came from people choosing convenience over understanding. Ethan held his notebook closer. "So they thought my project was too complicated?" he asked. Mrs. Whitmore looked at him. "I thought the judges would not have enough time." Ethan nodded slowly. The answer hurt, but it also revealed something important. Nobody had proven he was wrong. They had only decided he was too difficult to understand. Dr. Harris closed the laptop. Science does not always begin with something easy to explain. He looked at the judges. Sometimes it begins with someone willing to spend more time looking. Daniel noticed Ethan standing a little taller. Not because he had won. The fair was not finished yet. But because someone had finally separated the truth from the assumption. Then Mr. Lawson stepped forward again. His voice was calmer now. "Even if the description was changed, the question about the idea remains. A student can still be influenced by someone else." It was another reasonable concern. Another test of the evidence. Dr. Harris nodded. "Then we should examine the source." He turned toward Ethan. "Show us where the idea began." Ethan opened the notebook to the first page. The page everyone had overlooked. The page with the earliest drawing. The page that contained the first question he ever wrote about the project. And beside that question was a small note that made Daniel stop. It was not written by Ethan. It was written by someone who had seen the idea long before the science fair began. The first page of Ethan Miller's notebook looked ordinary. There were no impressive formulas covering every inch of the paper. No complicated words designed to make someone sound intelligent. Just a simple question written in a child's handwriting. But beside that question was a small note that changed the way everyone looked at the project. Dr. Harris leaned closer. "Who wrote this?" Ethan looked at the page. His expression changed slightly. "My dad." The room became quiet. Daniel Carter felt every eye turn toward him, but he did not move forward. He did not want the attention. He wanted Ethan's story to remain Ethan's story. "Your father?" Dr. Harris asked. Ethan nodded. "My real dad. Before he passed away, he used to help me with science questions." The answer surprised everyone. Daniel looked down at the notebook. He had seen that page before, but he had never thought it would become important. Years ago, Ethan's father had encouraged his curiosity. He had written one sentence in the notebook before his illness took him away. "Never stop asking why." That sentence was not a scientific discovery. It was not proof of an invention, but it explained something important. Ethan had not suddenly created an idea overnight. He had been building a habit of curiosity for years. Mr. Lawson watched carefully. "A parent helping a child is normal," he said. "But that does not prove the project is entirely his own work." Daniel agreed. The question was fair. A child's achievement should be based on truth, not sympathy. "Then check the evidence," Daniel said calmly. "That is what the notebook is for." Dr. Harris nodded. The board members began reviewing the earliest entries again. They compared the writing style, the dates, and the development of the project. The pattern became clear. The early pages contained questions Ethan had written himself. Later pages contained experiments, corrections, and observations. His father's note was encouragement, not creation. One judge pointed to a section near the beginning. "These measurements are written months before the final design." Another judge checked the submission date. "The timeline matches." Ethan stood quietly as adults discussed his work. But something had changed. He was no longer waiting for someone to decide if he belonged. He was watching people finally understand what he had been trying to explain. Daniel noticed the difference. It was a small change, the kind most people would miss. Ethan's shoulders were no longer lowered. His voice was no longer disappearing before he spoke. The boy who had entered the gym expecting rejection was now answering questions with confidence. Then Dr. Harris turned toward the judges. "There is still one thing we need to verify." Everyone looked at him. The practical application. The notebook showed the process. The timeline showed the development. But science required one more thing. Could the method work under different conditions? The judges decided to run another test. Not to punish Ethan. Not to challenge him unfairly. To respect the work enough to examine it properly. Daniel stepped back again. He watched Ethan prepare the demonstration. "Remember," Daniel said quietly, "you do not need to prove you are better than anyone." Ethan looked at him. "Then what do I need to prove?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Just prove you understand your own work." The test began. The room watched carefully. Ethan followed each step from his notebook. The first results appeared. They were close but not exact. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. Mr. Lawson noticed immediately. "That does not seem consistent." Dr. Harris did not answer. He looked at Ethan. "What do you think happened?" Ethan studied the results. He did not panic. He opened the notebook and searched through the pages. Then he found something. A note written weeks earlier. A warning he had recorded after another failed attempt. Ethan looked up slowly. The environment changed. Dr. Harris examined the note. "You predicted this problem?" Ethan nodded. "I just did not know if it would happen today." The judges looked at each other. The test had not failed. It had revealed something else. Something Ethan had already understood. But before anyone could celebrate, one judge noticed the note was connected to a second document mentioned in the notebook. A document that was not in Ethan's possession anymore. A missing page. And suddenly the question became clear. What happened to the part of the notebook that could prove everything?